Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Garrett, Provost of Carnegie Mellon University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Carnegie Mellon's annual Simon Initiative Distinguished Lecture. And today, we're so excited to host Dr. Arthur Levine at this year's guest lecture. But before we welcome Arthur to the stage, I'd like to give a brief background on this special annual event. The lecture series is named in honor of Herbert Simon. Simon was an esteemed scientist, researcher, CMU faculty member, and founding father of several of today's most important scientific domains, including artificial intelligence. Simon earned the prestigious A.M. Turing Award for his work in computer science and won the 1978 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his pioneering theories in organizational decision-making. His impact in the worlds of science and economics and also on our university's own academic mission is far-reaching and unparalleled. In 2014, Carnegie Mellon established the Simon Initiative to harness the cross-disciplinary learning engineering ecosystem that Herbert Simon cultivated here. Part of the Simon Initiative's mission is to develop effective learning methods which CMU, or any university for that matter, can adapt to universally improve educational outcomes for learners. By refining centerpiece courses at our university, educators from several CMU colleges meet Simon's call to be innovative leaders in global approaches to improving teaching and learning. Reflecting on this philosophy in his autobiography, Models of My Life, Simon noted, "We measure our success not only by the quality of teaching and research on our own campus, but by our influence on intellectual and educational trends in the nation and internationally." Simon's beliefs are echoed in conversations held throughout our university even today regarding CMU's leadership role in the future of education. With numerous drivers of change influencing education and the workforce, Carnegie Mellon will need to think about how we will evolve, yet deliver on our tradition of excellence to ensure that our students will be poised for academic success. This year's distinguished Simon Lecture presenter is Dr. Arthur Levine, and he certainly understands the importance of forward-thinking pedagogy. Arthur is the 6th and current president of the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. The foundation, through its renowned fellowship program, recruits excellent and exceptional individuals, recent college graduates, as well as experienced professionals to careers in teaching. Arthur has received numerous honors, including Carnegie, Guggenheim, and Rockefeller fellowships, 25 honorary degrees, and the American Council on Education's Book of the Year Award for his publication, Reform of Undergraduate Education. During today's lecture, titled The Future of Higher Education, Three Forces with the Capacity to Transform America's Colleges and Universities, Arthur will explore the ways and processes that American higher education is expected to change in the years ahead, and as our country experiences profound demographic, economic, and technological shifts. Carnegie Mellon is very proud to provide a platform for conversations on such important and timely topics. Arthur, it's such a great honor to have you here with us today to deliver Carnegie Mellon's 2019 Simon Initiative Distinguished Lecture. All, please join me in welcoming Dr. Arthur Levine to the podium.
Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, I'm going to let that go. It's a real honor for me to be here for several reasons. One reason is I think CMU is one of the nation's most important, most innovative, and most likely to shape the future institutions in this country. Okay, I'm done. Are there any questions? Second reason is, I really do applaud the Simon Initiative. I think it really charts the direction that higher education needs to move in the years ahead in terms of its interdisciplinary focus and its focus on learning. And the third thing is, it's an extraordinary honor to give a lecture in Herbert Simon's name. I'm an organizational sociologist, and there aren't many figures who have greater importance or have made larger contributions to my field than him. So with all of that said, I probably ought to give you a truth in advertising warning, which is, I don't want to talk for a very long time, but that may not be obvious as you listen to me. And second, I need to tell you about my last set of course evaluations. I had one evaluation that said, if I had 20 minutes left to live, I would want to spend them in Arthur Levine's class. Huh? Because every minute with Arthur Levine feels like an hour. By those standards, we got about 2 days together, okay? The United States is experiencing profound, unrelenting, and accelerating demographic, economic, and technological change. The nation's population is changing color, moving, aging, and coming from abroad. The American economy is undergoing a transformation from a national, analog, industrial economy to a global digital information economy. And new digital technologies, and you know them all, the internet, mobile devices, big data, AI, VR, AR, have the capacity to reshape daily lives, have the capacity to reshape our institutions. Now, change of this magnitude and this scope is rare. The last time it occurred was the Industrial Revolution. And one of the consequences of this kind of change is that all of our social institutions, it's not just colleges, it's government, it's healthcare, it's media, all appear to be broken. They were all built for a different time, and they don't work as well as they once did. And they need to change. And change can occur in two kinds of ways. Change can either be a matter of reform and repair, which is what we tend to do with not-for-profits, or it can be a matter of reinvention and replacement, which is what we tend to do with for-profits. So I'm going to talk about one of those. I'm just going to talk about colleges today and universities. I'm not even going to address the whole of colleges and universities. They have three purposes: teaching, research, and service. I'm only going to talk about the first one. I'm only interested in teaching today, and curriculum, and learning. And so what's going to happen to higher ed? Well, so far we've had academics, journalists, researchers, investors, and entrepreneurs have all opined on this subject. And their conclusions fall into two main buckets. The first is the adaptive bucket. And that predicts the existing model of higher education will be fundamentally sustained. It's premised on the belief that higher education is continually reinventing itself, that perpetual change is built into its DNA. It holds that higher education will adapt to current societal changes as it adapted to those of the past through a process of reform, addition, and renovation. The second bucket can be labeled disruptive. It foresees a break with higher education's historic past and a fundamental remaking of the enterprise. So, problem is that we have leading academics on both sides of this issue. We have people like sociologist Stephen Brint, who say, this is the golden era. It's never been better than it is right now. And we have people like Clayton Christensen at Harvard, who are saying, by 2030, half of all America's colleges will be bankrupt. They both can't be right. So how do we choose? And the answer is, right now it's a crapshoot. You choose who you like. Neither one can present compelling evidence that indicates that his side is correct. So what I want to do is talk to you today about 3 factors, 3 areas, and let's look at the kind of impact they're going to have on higher education. Let's start with demographics, okay? I've already said, I should say one thing before we do that. I'm in the midst of writing a book about the future of higher education. And what it basically says is, you shouldn't have to bet. We need to look in 3 directions if we want to understand the future. The first is we need to look backward. We've already undergone one transformation. The industrial era transformation was every bit as large as what people are talking about today. The second is we need to look forward. Take the demographics, take the economics, take the technology, project them forward. And what do they say about tomorrow? And the third is look sideways. There are all kinds of knowledge organizations that have been forced to change much more quickly than we have. If you look at newspapers, or you look at movies, or you look at music, and in some respects, looking at them reveals some of the pressures we're going to feel. And they reveal some of the directions into which we may be pushed to move. I'm going to talk about 1.5 of those things. And the reason for talking about 1.5 of those things is that's all I've written so far. So that what I want to talk to you about, I'm actually not using this, am I?
You are.
What about the lavalier?
It's not hot.
Should I make it hot and turn this off? No. Okay. What I'm going to do is I want to talk to you about looking forward. And I want to conclude a little bit by talking about looking backward. Okay? Actually, it's not like this is the audience participation part. If you said no, I'd still do that. Okay. Let's look at demographics. I began with the notion the US population is changing color, moving, aging, and coming from abroad. Historically, the United States has been overwhelmingly white, at least since it was colonized. By 2045, whites will make up a minority of the population. By 2060, the change is really happening fastest among young people. By 2060, Hispanics will make up nearly 1/3 of the US population under 19, and whites will only be a couple of points ahead. So where do we stand? The story is different in every region of the country. They're all facing different demographic futures. Right now, California, Florida, New Mexico, and Texas, with New York and New Jersey close behind, are already majority-minority. 10 cities in 9 states are majority Black, 28 cities in 4 states are majority Hispanic, and 1 city is approaching majority Asian. So what's that mean for us? It means that the fastest growing populations in this country are those with which our education system has been least successful. That they're far behind in terms of an achievement gap. They're far behind in terms of educational attainment. So what we're going to see in the next several years is enormous pressure to increase access to these newly growing populations and increase graduation rates. And we're going to find is growing accountability on the part of policymakers, or demands for accountability on the part of policymakers aimed at higher education. We're going to see from the business community that needs these populations to staff their enterprises. We're going to see it from the public. Things like pay for performance are going to increase. Notions of tying college and university resources at the federal level, at state levels, may well be tied in the same way that it is now for healthcare, to hitting targets, to making regulations. Now, college cost and student debt are the third rail, and those will not go unchecked. Debt is mounting dramatically each year, and the sense of unhappiness is rising commensurately with it. I watched a conversation not long ago between two education governors. One was Governor Hunt from North Carolina, and the other was Governor Tom Kean from New Jersey, who'd also been a university president. And what he said was, Kean said, talking to three research university presidents, so the financial model of higher education, he said, is fundamentally broken. And Governor Hunt jumped in and said, you can't charge whatever you want to charge and expect people to pay for it. And the three presidents looked at them as if they were speaking Martian and said, don't you understand? Every extra dollar we charge is only to buy more quality. And they said, you've asked the wrong question. The right question is, who's paying? And we think government ought to put a lot more money into higher ed. I see people nodding around the room. That had absolutely no traction with the two governors. They thought these guys were crazy. That's an issue we're dealing with. Policymakers and higher education leaders speak very different languages, have very different values, and different priorities. What answer are we going to find for rising tuition and rising debt? It could be anything from price controls to free college. I think the free college movement's going to gain. We have a program every year in which we bring together two policymakers and two higher education leaders from 4 different states. And this year they brought up all kinds of issues they'd never brought up before. And some of those issues were things like sub-baccalaureate credentials. Some of those issues were, what do we do to give people specialized education who aren't getting it now and give them new futures? And they were talking about micro-credentials, badges, things that aren't degrees. And we found that to be the case this year in conversations in Tennessee, Colorado, and Montana. The 4th state this year is Pennsylvania, which had even more ambitious goals. Okay, next, the population's moving. In 1960, a majority of Americans, 54%, lived in the Northeast. Today, 62% of America, or Northeast or Midwest, sorry. Today, 62% of Americans live in the West and the South. One result is that in the Northeast and the Midwest, there were too many colleges and not enough students to fill their halls. While 38% of the population resides in the Northeast and Midwest, 45% of our colleges are located in this region, and 55% of our private colleges. And you're starting to read the stories now. This isn't about Carnegie Mellon. What this is about is low endowment, private, liberal arts colleges, And we're seeing rising numbers of those begin to close their doors or merge. And you can probably expect that to increase. I was talking to the New England Board of Higher Education. I said, come on, what % of your colleges of that type are on the ropes these days? And they said, if we're being conservative, at least a third. The next few years are going to be big changes in terms of higher education. By the way, top-tier schools won't be as affected. They're unlikely to be affected, and what will happen to top-tier schools, and this is one of them, is applications can be expected to keep growing. The challenge in the West is exactly the reverse. Too many students, not enough higher education. So what I'd look for in the next few years is survival-driven experimentation in the East and the Midwest among colleges that are struggling desperately to stay open. And innovation at scale in the West and the South. California, for example, is creating a virtual community college that'll focus only on older adults, people over 25. Will focus only on children, and what they will do with that is they're not going to offer many degree programs. They're going to offer sub-baccalaureate credentials. And their primary focus is going to be on upskilling and reskilling. It's going to be a model you're going to hear a lot about in the years to come. Third factor is Americans are aging. In 1960, 13% of the population was 65 or older, and 39% were 19 or younger. In 2035, for the first time in this country's history, the senior population, 65 and older, will surpass the number of people in the population who are under 19. And between 2012 and 2050, that's not so far away, the 65 plus population will nearly double to 43 million and then to 84 million. So what this means is, instead of paying into the programs they've historically paid into, like Social Security and healthcare and other senior programs, they're going to be withdrawing those programs. They're going to be taking revenues from those programs. The two biggest items in state budgets now are their welfare programs, including senior programs, and healthcare, and education. And I think what we're really headed to, and we need planning to avoid this, is a generational clash over how we spend our money. Tell you what, why don't we skip the fourth, which is Americans coming from abroad. I don't see any good that can come out of a conversation on that topic right now. How's higher education need to respond to the things I've talked about before? It can do it largely by adaptation. It can keep doing largely what it's doing and adapt to these new realities. They don't require fundamental changes in the nature of higher education. Let's turn to the economy. I said it was making a transition from national analog industrial economy to a global digital information economy. So what's that mean in English? And what I'm really talking about is a shift in an economy from one focused on making and distribution of material goods to one focused on creation and dissemination of knowledge. A shift in an economy from one powered by natural resources and physical labor to an economy driven by knowledge and minds. So what that means is both the jobs that are available and the educational levels that are required and the kinds of skills that are required will change profoundly. They've done so already, and they'll continue to change. So look, if you went to sleep in 1947, which is even before I was born, and you woke up today, the economic landscape would be nearly unrecognizable, be turned upside down. You'd find the great cities of America, the capitals of industrial America, Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, and Baltimore. By the way, the story of Pittsburgh is an incredible anomaly and a great success story. And you'd find those to be devastated by deindustrialization and struggling to reinvent themselves in a region now called the Rust Belt. You'd learn that small provincial cities they'd probably never given a second thought to. Western cities, Seattle, San Jose, Austin, Portland, were inventing a new American economy. And their population now totaled more than 8 million. You'd find industrial era jobs in the fields of manufacturing, construction, and mining had all but disappeared, dropping from nearly half of all jobs to under 20%. And the boom had come in knowledge economy jobs, which have moved dramatically in the other direction. And you'd find one other thing, that our children are competing for jobs with peers from India, Korea, and Indonesia. The requirements for getting those jobs has changed too. The recession accelerated the change. It actually telescoped it. At the depth of the recession, 7.2 million jobs had been lost. By 2016, 11.6 million jobs had been created. Of those new jobs, nearly 3 out of 4 required a baccalaureate, and 98% required some form of post-secondary education. Of the 5.6 million jobs that had been lost to people with a high school diploma or less, only 80,000 came back. 5.6 million, 80,000. The bottom line is there's been no recovery for people with a high school diploma or less. And what's also interesting is that during the recession, people with graduate degrees actually gained jobs. So where are we? The implication is we need more education and higher skill levels to get a job. We also need a different kind of education. And it's being given all kinds of names, but probably the one that stuck to it most clearly is 21st century skills. And for me, and nobody in the room may agree with me, I think what 21st century skills defines is a new general education core. General education, liberal arts have changed over the last millennium. They're no longer the trivium and quadrivium. They become disciplinary. And I think in the years to come, we're going to find that they require 2 different sets of skills. Can't wait to find out what they are. One is a set of skills required to change or to succeed in the time of change. It's critical thinking, it's creativity, it's continuous learning, it's crack detecting, it's problem solving, it's flexibility, it's adaptability, and things of that ilk. The other basket focuses on the areas in which change is currently occurring, such as technology and media literacy skills, reflecting this nation's shift from an analog to a digital technology. It's cross-cultural competence, rooted in both the increasing diversity of our own population in America and the advent of global society. It's knowledge literacy and data management skills, which are essential for an information age in which information is exploding. It's teamwork, collaboration, communication competencies. And they're needed for workplaces in the knowledge economy, which are growing more horizontal than vertical in terms of their organization. Bottom line, Americans need, as a result of the economic changes, more education at higher levels than ever before. For the first time, there are more college graduates than high school graduates in the workforce. And it's translating into demands by policymakers and employers. Again, greater access, greater graduation rates, increased college attendance, increased completion. At the same time, states are driving up graduation standards, though the increase in student readiness for college has not yet become apparent. How will higher education respond to all of these things? These are sort of like demographics. They don't demand a fundamental remaking of the current design of higher education. They do demand some major adaptation. They do demand some additions. They do demand some changes, but they won't throw the model on its head. Let's talk about technology. How much longer do I have?
15 minutes, 20 minutes.
Okay. Technology. Look, I feel a little like Rip Van Winkle these days. 1829 story describes a guy who goes to bed. He sleeps for 20 years. He wakes up. He doesn't know that he slept for 20 years. He thinks it's one night. He doesn't recognize the people. He doesn't recognize the buildings. He doesn't recognize anything in his community. And he says he thinks he's going mad. My grandmother was born before the airplane was invented. My kids were born after humans landed on the moon. I think about the things that exist today that didn't exist when I was growing up. Alexa, iWatches, PCs, iPads, Kindles, smartphones, audio and video streaming, light bulbs, microwaves. Okay, I just wanted to see if you were paying attention. We did have light bulbs when I grew up. They had recently been invented, and microwaves, ATMs, driverless cars. One of the most interesting things to me is that the largest hotel company in the world doesn't own any hotels. The largest taxi company in the world doesn't own any taxis. The largest provider of music in the world doesn't own music. I think about the things that are here that are gone now. They were cutting edge not too many years ago. Whether it's Blockbuster, or iPods, or cassette tapes, or CDs, or VCRs, or Netscape, or Borders, or a gazillion computer brands, or the daily newspaper. They're just disappearing. I was doing a book about millennials, and I did some focus groups. And I asked the students in that focus group, how are you dealing with this deluge of new technologies? And one of them looked at me and he gave me what I considered at the time a really wise-ass answer. But I've since come to believe it's brilliant. I named a chapter in the book I wrote about this generation after this. And what he said was, it's not technology unless it happens after you're born. It was just always there. How are you guys doing with cars? A lot of you probably have refrigerators, right? They were just there. And for kids who are in college now, they were born after the founding of Amazon, Apple, Google, and Netflix. Kids in middle school were born after the founding of Facebook, Spotify, and Twitter. A friend told me about a question his young daughter had asked him. And she said, he told her that they had no PCs or mobile devices when he was growing up. And She said, well, how did you get on the internet? It had always been there for her. It's impossible to imagine a world in which the internet doesn't exist. One problem we're going to face, and it's going to be true in colleges and universities all over the country, is that when we have our digital natives being taught, at least for the time being, by digital immigrants, and in many universities, not this one, they're still analog. It creates profound differences, which I'm not going to go into because we don't have the time. But if somebody were to ask me about a question about that, I would certainly answer. Okay. So what we got then. The Industrial Revolution occurred in two phases. The first, beginning in the early 19th century, was built on iron and powered by steam. The second, starting in the late 19th century, was created of steel and driven by petroleum and electricity. And I would argue, I asked for that signal when it was time for me to stop. Thank you. Today's technological revolution is likely to have two phases as well, as far as education is concerned. The first is going to be driven by the internet and mobile devices. And colleges have accommodated to those to some degree. There's no campus in which both aren't integral to what goes on. The second is going to be driven by big data, AI, VR, and AR. And what we know is, I'm sort of amazed at the number. Every day we are producing 15.6 quintillion, that's 15 zeros, bits of data. And we now have the capacity to figure out what to do with a lot of that data. We have the capacity to use it in ways we've never been able to use it before. AI, there's a joke, an old joke, about the factory of the future, which is going to consist of a bunch of machines, one person, and a dog. And the dog is going to be there to make sure the person doesn't touch any of the machines. And you know what artificial intelligence is. It's all the stuff happening around us. This is one school where I don't need to explain that. You can see it in everything you're doing. Okay, VR and AR. You know what those things are too. Facebook website includes a story. It's less of a commonplace story, but it strikes many people as extraordinary. The reader's on a train, having an intimate conversation with the person sitting next to him or her about their hobbies, their relationships, and their goals. There's one small wrinkle. The reader is actually wearing a VR headset. The train is virtual, and the companion and the person are both avatars. It's a very different future than what we've known educationally. So what's it mean? The first phase, as far as campuses are concerned, is going to be the internet and mobile devices to which they're adapting. The second phase is going to be the rest. Big data, AI, VR, AR, and that's going to produce dramatic changes. Textbooks will become relics. We can get the education, we can get the materials that our particular group of students need. Education can be customized. Time won't matter. We'll have credit-based education, we'll have new credentials. I was on a plane. I was reading about the travel agency of the future. And what it said was, and the reason I was doing that was I finished all the work I had to do. I finished the book I'd brought to read. And in desperation, I read the airline magazine. Well, the travel agency of the future, you know what it is. You're not going to read about it in some pamphlet. They're going to take you to the beach. You can walk the beach. You can go into the restaurant. You can go into your room. You can see how small that room really is. and how lousy the view out the window is. And the truth of that is that if we can do that, if we can create that, why can't we create Paris in the 15th century? Why can't we create America on the eve of the Revolutionary War? Why can't we create Rome? Why can't we create 5th century Athens? Why can't we create Imperial China? If we can do those things, tell me how a stand-up lecture on any of those subjects is going to hold up. If what I can do is walk around in 15th century Paris, smell the smells, which had to be putrid, they didn't have a sewer system. I can talk to people. I can look inside the buildings. Yeah, there's more for me to learn, but that's pretty real. We're going to see virtual colleges. I told you about California, but that's really not the biggest deal. Today, 20% of all college students are full-time, residential, and 18 to 22 years of age. Under 20%. The question you got to ask is this a population for which college isn't their biggest concern? They're doing a lot of other stuff. They have families, they have jobs, they have friendships, they have relationships, college isn't even the biggest deal in their lives. Why can't we create a virtual college for those people that are just driving to school to take a course, as California is doing? They're not taking the electives. They're not using the new fancy dance gym. They're not meeting with advisors. They're not taking the services the university offers. They're just coming for classes. Right now, what we could do is create that classroom. And I can take a class in that classroom, even though it's being offered at Carnegie Mellon. And a colleague can take that class, and she's from Beijing. And I can sort of nudge her and say, I'm sorry, my mind wandered. What did the professor just say? Into Chinese, back into English. Professor can assign the two of us to do a project together for the next class. I can ask her to have tea after class. If I can do all of those things, and I'm hardly spending any time on campus, why do I need a real college campus? Now, I don't think any of those are the biggest change we're going to see. I think the biggest change is this. Lifelong education is going to become something very, very, very real. 80% of all job loss in this country has been due to automation. The loss of all those jobs I described in the manufacturing sector actually increased productivity and output. The reason that more than 4 out of 5 of those jobs could be automated is that slashed labor costs, increased manufacturing flexibility, efficiency, consistency, and output. Today, automation is spreading beyond low-skilled jobs, requiring a high school diploma or less. The research indicates that somewhere between 5 and 47% of all jobs we lost to automation. That's a pretty big gap. If it's 5%, I think we ought to feel badly. If it's 40%, we ought to feel horrible. I'm really scared. I don't like those studies very much. There's a great study by McKinsey in which they took jobs apart and said, what proportion of jobs will be affected? And their conclusion was that roughly 51% of all working hours could be automated. May be true, may not be true. What we're talking about is routine work. And we're talking about it at all levels of education and in all professions. Yeah, it includes cashiers, it includes clerical support, it includes administrative assistants, but it also includes doctors, lawyers, and journalists. So here's what we know. First, we're going to see all this automation. In 29 states, the most common job is being a truck driver. Okay. How long is that going to last? Well, most Americans are going to see minor to major changes, even in industries that are unlikely to be affected materially by automation. The half-life of knowledge is getting shorter and shorter. The result is we're going to need to be upskilled and reskilled throughout our careers. And what that means is there's going to be a burgeoning demand for just-in-time education. And let me explain what I mean by that. What we tend to offer students now is just-in-case education. We're going to offer you 4 years of college, just in case, and we think you're really going to need it, but it's just in case you need it. Just-in-time education says, I need to learn Swahili by Thursday. I need to learn this new language. I need to learn anything. I need to learn it immediately. What it means is this population is likely to be larger than the traditional collegiate population, much larger, because we're doing this multiple times in our lives. And what's also going to be true is it's going to vary in content and duration, anything from a few hours to a few years. It ignores established time standards, uniform course lengths, traditional credit measures. It deliberately and intentionally champions variation. It requires a non-time-based accounting system. It's going to have to focus on the outcomes we want to achieve, not the amount of time you spend studying for those. It's not going to lead to traditional degrees. We need new forms of certification, micro-credentials, badges, and we're going to change the nature of a college transcript. It's going to be all the educational experience you've had in your life and all the outcomes that you have mastered and some indication of where you got it. The providers can be anybody. Would you rather have a certificate in programming from Microsoft or Google or Eastern Northern State University? Which has more appeal? The question also becomes, given that the largest producer of teacher professional development in STEM is now PBS. The museum down the block from me is offering a doctorate in astrophysics. I'm going to tell a publisher story. Can I get 5 more minutes? 5 more minutes, please. And here's the story. I went to visit a publisher. I'm sitting in his anteroom, and I'm looking at the books all over the walls. And he finally comes out, and he says, we're not in the book business anymore. And I said, what business are you in? And he said, we're in the knowledge business. And I think he saw me roll my eyes. And then he said, well, let me give you an example. Subtext. Let me give you an example even you can understand. And what he said was, we are now providing professional development to teachers in something like 12,000 schools. There's no university in the United States that has that kind of penetration. I figured I still had him. I said, where are you getting your content from? At the time I was president of Teachers College. And I thought, he's got to come to me. He said, we hire full-time content providers. I thought about that for a moment. I don't know anybody who's a full-time content provider. My parents had no friends who were full-time content providers. My neighbors aren't full-time content providers. So I asked him, what's a full-time content provider? And he explained it to me, and I realized I just had another name for them. I called them professors. And he could give them stock options and bonuses, and I couldn't. So I asked him, what about credentialing? He said, yeah, that's a problem. He said, we're working on it. They're not working on it anymore. They have degree granting authority from New York State. What we're going to see is more and more players like that. And here's what I think is going to happen. I think the changes in Demography, the economy, and technology are going to demand changes from higher education. Initially, colleges are going to be able to respond by adaptation, adding the new to the historic core. But eventually, adaptation will no longer suffice. The information economy, technologies like big data, AI, and VR mature, they're going to cause disruption. And we're going to see the demand for new kinds of education that focus on learning over teaching, outcomes over process and the clock, an end of time-based instruction, demise of the Carnegie unit, individualization of education, outcome or competency-based assessment, new certifications, lifelong transcripts, not of experiences, but of competencies mastered, a multiplicity of higher education providers, many of whom are not in operation now. Bottom line, last part of my speech. I think we're heading into dinner here. So that the last part of my speech, I told you I was going to give you a look at the past. Higher education changed during the Industrial Revolution. It went through 7 stages. The first stage was broad criticism by policymakers, media, and the public. Connecticut told Yale, we won't fund you anymore in 1827 because your curriculum's irrelevant to the world we live in. Yale responded, and this is the second stage, by saying, you're wrong. Rejection. Third stage, experimentation. Went on trying all the things that spelled the difference between the college of the colonial era and the university of today. After the Civil War, we began creating models. Johns Hopkins for graduate education, Cornell for the comprehensive university, MIT, hoping someday it could be CMU, pioneering in technical education. We saw diffusion. The mainstream adopted it. We saw standardization and integration. We're at stage 3. And you guys are engaged in a whole bunch of very serious experiments that could determine the future. You have one more big opportunity. And that big, probably a lot of big opportunities, but this is one of them. It's the diffusion. It's being the model. In the earlier transformation, one university led the transformation, and it had a leader who took the lead in doing that. It was Harvard. It was a guy named Charles Eliot, who was an MIT product. This time we're going to need another leader. We're going to need another institution to carry out the diffusion. And if Carnegie Mellon wished, it has the capacity to be that leader. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for some questions. We have people on the sides who have microphones. Please raise your hand, and we'll acknowledge you, and we'll find you the microphone. And if you start answering your question before the microphone, shout so we can all hear you.
And I apologize for going long.
Oh, that was great. Down in the front.
I'm going to ask for a favor. Tell me who you are, tell me your name, and tell me an embarrassing secret you've never told anybody before. 2 out of 3 will be fine.
I'm Sasha. One of the things that's been noticed in new forms of education, for instance, in virtual classes have a very high dropout rate, or there's concern that you lose, with a campus, you lose things like people meeting people in the hallway and having discussions, or being able to just casually run into a study group. Do you think this future technology has solutions to this kind of thing, or how is that going to be handled?
That's an excellent question. There are other excellent questions in the room. No, I will answer it, Sasha. The reality is we tend to use every new technology the way we use the last technology. So when we created radio, We read books on radio. We put plays on the radio. When we got television, we put radio on the television. And now what we're doing for the most part is we use these new technologies, is we're doing what we've always done with them. It's only recently that universities have begun to take advantage of the fact that digital technology and the internet allow for two-way communication. And it can be almost instantaneous two-way communication. We're going to look back on what exists now, and we're going to see it as primitive. So do not take what exists now to be what's going to exist in the future. What this is an indication of where we are now. The other guys are going to take it to where it can go. Please. Oh, I'm not calling on them.
Hi. Hello. Cognitive
Who
science.
are you?
Oh, my name's Lucia Bevilacqua. Hello.
Nice to meet you, Lucia.
So, cognitive scientist Dan Willingham says critical thinking is not a skill, but a matter of knowing enough about a subject to make a valuable judgment. Because people who think critically about one subject can't solve problems in something they know nothing about, because knowledge is what we think with. With that in mind, how do you define critical thinking, and how do you think that in the future it can be taught as a generic and transferable skill?
How much time do we have left? My feeling on that one is you can't teach any skill without content. You just can't do it. What we're talking is the capacity to use content, to ask questions about content, and to engage in sophisticated understanding and analysis of that content and consider other alternatives. That's critical thinking. I think it's foolish to think of it. I think that debate doesn't make any sense. Don't ask me to choose. Do I want my arm or my leg? I want them both.
Hi there, I'm Victoria, and you were talking briefly about higher education funding. And one strategy that some universities are adopting is where instead of paying tuition, you pay a fraction of your future salary. Do you think this idea is going to be successful in the future? And if not, then why?
I've always loved that idea. Did everybody hear the question? Okay. I've always loved that idea a lot. And there have been some experiments with it, and there have been real mixed results, but I don't remember why. So that I don't think that it's a panacea, but it makes all kinds of sense to me. If you've benefited a great deal from that education, shouldn't you be responsible for that, or shouldn't you take advantage of that? And if we do that, and if we keep the current system, you'd be a fool to take a low-paying job. You'd be a fool to work in the social sector. You'd be an idiot to be a teacher. We can't afford a society in which all social commitment is impossible because you can't afford to make it possible. So regardless if we went with your model or other kinds of models, what we have now just doesn't work. You must have somebody on this side. No, they put all the people here who had no questions.
Hi, my name's Chris. I'm a staff member, a vintage alumna, and a parent of a recent graduate. Outcomes-based learning, right? Sounds very like I get a badge, I get a certification, I can pass the exam and get my license. I know how to do this technology. Who knows how to think about it? Who knows how to assess the trends like you just did, right? How do we train those people, and how does education still maintain the humanity behind it?
We've been trying to, we being the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, we've been trying to reinvent what ed schools look like. And Raphael Reif, who's the president of MIT, and I decided, let's do a project together. Let's create the 21st century ed school. So we raised some money, we raised $20-odd million, and decided, let's create a new ed school to be independent of MIT. It'll be freestanding, though associated. And the goal will be, the reason for doing that is, very candidly, we didn't want to take it through faculty governance. Okay? So we said, okay, piece of cake. So here's what we're going to do. The first thing we're going to do is define a series of competencies that teachers need, since it was teacher education program we're doing first. And that was really, really hard. Really hard. We spent well over a year doing that. But that was the easy part. The next part is, how do you assess and teach people to be able to do those things? A lot of the competency-based programs now tend to be too simplistic. They have a gazillion competencies, and they're atomistic. And they're things like, raise your left hand. Okay, you just met number 273. And what happens then is we're saying they don't work that way. They're inextricably intertwined. So how do you create a program in which you're linking competencies? So you're actually linking activities that make sense and not simply creating all these unaligned, random sets of things to do. We spent 3 years on that, trying to create an individualized path to achieve those competencies. Then we realized we had a huge problem, which was clinical education. That's only defined in terms of hours. How do you tie clinical education to outcomes? That took us another 2 years. At some point, we called together a group of people who thought about this sort of stuff. And we said, how do we do that? And somebody said, well, in education, what you might do is you take your best students, your best, and you give them 1 semester of student teaching. Your average student does 2 semesters. And your poorest students do 3 semesters. As I thought about this deeply, that still sounded like it was time-based. How do we tie this to outcomes? All this is really hard. And I can't tell you we've created the best thing since sliced bread. What I can tell you is we're reinventing what's going on. And what happens with each of these things? I talked about a period of experimentation. That's where we are, right now. And we're going to experiment in creating all these things. The only thing I'm positive of is that learning is going to triumph over teaching. And the reason I say that is, it doesn't matter how long you're taught if you haven't learned it. What matters is, what do you know and what are you able to do? And that's really the important ingredient in education. The fact that people will say it requires a narrowing of education means that we did a terrible job in defining the outcomes.
One more question.
You have a lot of power in your hands. Oh,
Hi.
this better be really good.
Okay. I'm Jordan. So I feel like a lot of what you're talking about is education becoming very outcomes based, right? And I think that one of the values today of higher education is that it's achievement based, and that the reason people want to go to college is because they want to achieve things in this world, right? And if you're talking about a world where people are only achieving competency in things, then how do you kind of retain the value of wanting to achieve more than just competency?
And competency is a really crummy word. It's just a really, really crummy word. What we're really asking is, as a consequence of having gone through this experience, what do we want you to know and be able to do? And as opposed to, if you took my class and I lectured at you for the next 15 weeks, 45 minutes at each lecture, I'm not sure that would be better. And that's what happens in a lot of what we're doing. All I'm saying is, this isn't about what you're exposed to. This is about what you've really learned. And I think that's a huge advantage. The reality is, we all learn at different paces. You can probably learn a lot of things a lot faster than I can. But if what we care about is not fixing the time, not fixing the process, but fixing the result, that just seems to me a much stronger way to go. But that's my opinion. And I promise you, That opinion is worth everything you've paid for it.
All right, let's thank the speaker. I have a small token of our appreciation before the honorarium check is cut. Thank you again.
Thank you.
So let me ask you all to join us outside for reception, and let me make a very brief plug for the next university lecture. April 16th, we have Sam Quinones. He's a journalist, a storyteller, and an opiate epidemic specialist. And he's going to begin his talk at 4:30 here in the Seaman Auditorium. And his most recent book is Dreamland, The True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic. Thank you again to Arthur Levine.